Hello and welcome to another video review. This is King's Quest V, Absence Makes the Heart Go Yonder, for various PC systems of the early 90s, as well as the NES. This is the fifth game in the King's Quest series and the follow-up to King's Quest for the Perils of Rosella. And this one's kind of interesting because they actually changed up quite a bit in this one as compared to the previous four games and just altogether. And that was partly because this is a point-and-click game. So not only is the interface completely different from the previous games, but the visuals and everything were also upped considerably. So I actually have a fair amount to talk about in this one compared to the previous three reviews I did. So another interesting thing about King's Quest V is that it was released in three separate versions, basically. You had the original floppy disk version, which is not what you're seeing here. You're actually seeing the CD-ROM version, which they added in later, and that was the one that is known as the talkie version, because it had voice acting, and that was a brand new thing for the time. People were just like, whoa, voice acting! And so, again, Sierra's sitting there pushing all these new things on the adventure game genre with the King's Quest series, and it's a really cool thing. And then there was the NES version of this game. Yes, NES. And that one was actually a bit censored, believe it or not. And that didn't really make any sense because this game is, even today, is rated E. So when you get to the NES version, and it actually censored a line because it was religious. Yeah, religious themes. Because Nintendo, right? Anyway. The real question is, how did all this change affect the game? Did it live up to its predecessors, or what happened? Well, as far as the presentation goes, like I said before, it was a huge step up from the previous games in the series. Now, this might sound funny to you today, because we're living in the age of 1920 by 1080 and all that kind of thing. But back then, this was really high-res and just mind-boggling in terms of the visual quality. Why? Well, when you talk about the original games, you're talking about games that are running on 320 by 200 resolution and are 16 colors. This one is 256 colors and 640 by 400. Huge resolution for the time. So this took advantage of all the advances in technology that you saw at the time, and it ended up looking absolutely gorgeous as a result. Now, today, obviously, it doesn't look all that amazing, but it's aged really well. You can still tell what things are. It's still well detailed. Animations and such are still pretty smooth, which is surprising. And there's this really nice charm to the graphics. It really brings back that fairy tale vibe that you got from the previous games, particularly with the first and second games. And so they did a really good job with that. It's bright, it's colorful, there's a lot going on in the environments, and it's, again, it still looks good even today. It's aged very, very well. And then you have the interface, of course, which, because it's a point-and-click game, is actually much cleaner than the previous interface, where it actually was a very stark contrast against the game itself. This one actually fits the game a lot more. It blends in better. And it feels like it fits the game a lot more than the previous game's interfaces did, which, admittedly, they worked, but they were just kind of there. You didn't really like them all that much. This one feels much more intuitive as to how it works out. And instead of popping up with a big box that tells you, hey, enter your thing here, you can just click on things and it doesn't really obstruct your view, so that's a very good thing. As far as the sound design goes, it was also a huge step up. You're talking about the difference between just plain PC speaker noises and actual sound effects. And voice acting, if you had the CD version, which just, whoa, voice acting. And it's actually pretty good voice acting, too, except for Cedric, who's just kind of annoying, but that's because of what the character is, not really the voice. But the voice acting is actually pretty good in this game, and even today, when you look at a lot of games out there that have really cheesy voice acting, or it's really awful, you can look at this and be like, well, they got it back in 1990, what's going on, guys? And so, and you combine that with music that's, again, MIDI still, but that was the standard for the time. And the music is also giving this very nice fairy tale fantasy vibe, and is actually a bit more detailed than the previous games. It all blends together to create a very, very nice presentation that even today has aged very, very well. But what really matter are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this one is, I feel, where the series really hit its stride. Because not only could it be more complex because they had more storage space to work with, we're talking megabytes instead of kilobytes here, that's a pretty big deal, but because they actually put more complexity into the story just in the way it ties in with the rest of the series. And so, before I get into that, the basic story of this game is you play once again as King Graham, and he's out walking in Daventry, and he comes back to find that the castle Daventry is gone. It's just gone. And this talking owl comes up to him and tells him what happened. Basically, this evil wizard Mordak stole the castle, with a spell, obviously. But Cedric brings Graham to this new land where the Owl's Master resides. And the Owl's Master is the good wizard Crispin, who tells him, hey, you can have this advice, and here, have this old wand I've got, and you just go forth in adventure, basically. And so Graham's on a quest to get his family back, basically. He's trying to be the big hero again. And to do that, of course, he wanders around this new land and finds items, talks to people, solves puzzles, that sort of thing. And this was actually where it got really interesting, because not only was the world more fleshed out in this one, but you actually learn a villain's motivation. Yeah. It was really surprising. Because, I mean, the villain's motivation is pretty simple, don't get me wrong, but it ties in with another game in the series that was previous to this one, obviously. And it actually, if you played the next game in the series, it actually sets up some story elements for that. So, this actually ties in with the rest of the series. It feels like a more complete experience with the storyline, and I really don't want to spoil what ties in with the rest of the series in it. But suffice to say, the game actually ends up being way more interesting in terms of its story and its storytelling than the previous games. All of them. Combined. And so, what does that mean for the gameplay? I mean, you've got actually a pretty solid storyline, even though it is fairly simple for the most part. It still has that charm about it, that fairy tale-esque charm, but this is more fantasy vibe than fairy tale. Whereas, the gameplay has changed. And that may sound like a bad thing to some degree. I mean, it went to a point-and-click interface. That means less interactivity, right? Not really. In fact, there was more interactivity in this than there was in all of the previous games. You can look at more things. You can find out what things are. It has more to say about certain things than the previous games would. And because they had more stuff to work with, they could actually put in more development in the world around you and how the puzzles work and that sort of thing. And while the puzzles aren't particularly difficult, and if you know what you're doing, obviously, and it's not really that hard to figure out what the puzzles are and how to solve them and that sort of thing, but they actually flow in with the game pretty well, and they actually help progress the storyline pretty well. Whereas in the previous games, some of the puzzles felt like they were just there to be puzzles. And that was a problem with adventure games in general, don't get me wrong. But this one, it feels much more natural, even though there are some really odd, silly elements with it. Like, you are in this nice forested area, and then you take a few screens to the left, and suddenly you're in a desert. And you're like, wait, what? Okay, whatever. But the gameplay actually is more intuitive than the previous games. It's much easier to get into and enjoy. And on top of that, it retains the challenge that the previous games had. Some of the puzzles are still pretty difficult, and they require you to really think outside the box and just not look at the situation and be like, this is what would typically happen. You actually have to look at things like, what is Sierra's logic here? And luckily, Sierra's logic in this game is still actually intelligible. Unlike in some other adventure games where you just sit there going, wait, what? And like the third game in the series, it does a pretty good job of giving you some idea of what you need to do. It never really goes too ridiculous with the puzzles to where it just you have no idea what you're doing. But there are still ways to screw up. You can still fail in this game like you could in the previous ones. And it doesn't sit there and just tell you what you need to do. It gives you very subtle hints. And these hints are usually enough to figure out what you need to do if you use your brain. And that's partly why King's Quest V is one of the two best games in the series. Easily one of the two best in the series. When you combine that the gameplay is still challenging without feeling gimmicky or just newfangled technology, we have to use it or anything like that, it actually flows in very naturally with the game. And they built the game around it. You have this gameplay coupled with a story that's more interesting than the previous games, and it still actually holds a pretty interesting spot today. Even going back to it, you can sit there and go, oh, this is actually a pretty interesting storyline, even though it's fairly simple. And it ties in with the rest of the games. It feels like a very complete experience. And as a result, I can do absolutely nothing but recommend this game. Particularly if you are looking to get into adventure games. This was one of the ones that I played and I could just say, this is very special. This is a must-own. And again, this is where the series really hit its stride. But even though I absolutely love this game, it's actually not my favorite in the series. It's pretty close to my favorite in the series, but it's not quite there. And even though I can do nothing but recommend it, particularly if you're a fan of adventure games, particularly if you're a fan of the King's Quest series, I can actually recommend this to everybody. It's not only a historically relevant piece of gaming, but it's just a really enjoyable game. So, I hope you check it out. Thanks for watching.